The Age of Uncertainty podcast by Nigel Scale. The Scrum Guide Update 2020.
Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of the Age of Uncertainty podcast. Do you hear that? No, they've not shut down the main reactors. That was the nerd alarm, because I'm worried that this podcast is going to be the nerdiest one I've ever done, and oh boy, have I done some nerdy podcasts. You see, today we're going to do a quick dive into the latest update of the Scrum Guide, which should be coming out pretty much now. So I wanted to give a quick view of this and perhaps some of the interesting changes there. A lot of them are quite subtle, so I thought I'll bring them up and discuss them here and see what repercussions or consequences could arise from those changes. Now, as the nerd alarm warned you, this could get a little nitpicky, so if you love a little detail, this is the podcast for you. If you're not in that sort of space, then oh gosh, good luck. We're going to jump on straight in. The first thing I want to talk about is the Scrum Guide itself has got a lot thinner. Right? Over the years since I've been introduced to Scrum, Scrum has gradually thinned out, dropping more and more things out of its experience, and this update is no exception. The guide is thinner than it's ever been before. Multiple pages have fallen out. I could easily see a day when the Scrum Guide itself becomes a simple one-pager. Luckily, that's not today. Now, what's interesting for me is if you've seen my Nigel Scale that I invented over a decade ago and that I love and no one else seems to, but if you know my Nigel Scale, oh, you don't know the Nigel Scale? Here's my chance. The Nigel Scale, simple 3-point scale, 1, 2, 3, to look at Scrum and understand Scrum. Nigel Scale 1 is stuff that is core, that is fundamental, that if you bend it, everything breaks. This has always been what I would call Scrum Guide-tastic. The stuff in the guide is the core things we must do. But as we're seeing, that's changing over time. So are some of those core things no longer core? Were they never core? Does core for a team still line up with the Scrum Guide? I think that's a chat we should have. But that's Nigel Scale 1. Nigel Scale 2 is the interesting stuff, that what I used to call best practice, but these days we call good practice. The contextual stuff that works for other people, works in lots of other places, the patterns that may work for you. The key word though, of course, is may. It isn't one size fits all. We've got to be very contextual with this stuff. So those sort of good patterns are the patterns that you apply with discipline, but contextually, depending on your experience, depending on your area, and depending on your problem space. That's a lot of dependencies. And then Nigel Scale 3 is the bad stuff, the anti-patterns. You do that if you want, but it's going to get you into serious, serious trouble. Now, what's interesting with this movement in the Scrum Guide is it seems to be slimming out more and more of that Nigel Scale 2 stuff. More of that stuff that's about advice or good behaviour. It's just taking it out completely and trying to get purely to the absolute minimum Nigel Scale 1. And there's pros and cons about that. So this slimming seems to be inexorably linked to the idea of stretching Scrum outside of software. I know a lot of us for many years have been using Scrum outside software, and it seems that Schwaber and Sutherland are finally really embracing that with the guide. But by doing so, they're dropping a lot of that contextual good practice that would normally work in a good software team to allow the Scrum Guide to be more agnostic and to have wider applicability. Cool, huh? Well, yes and no. Because by making it slimmer and more applicable in more spaces, it's actually stripping away some of the help and advice that makes this stuff actually work. I have a concern that if we're not careful, we could end up making agile homeopathy, watering this down to such a low level that, yeah, it applies everywhere, but doesn't offer any value anywhere. But let's come back to that thought in a moment. So generally, the slimming of Scrum seems to be a good idea, but how slim is too slim? The guide is doing some interesting stuff about that slimming. You know what? This is a bit like C. I remember learning to program in C, and it's not C#, nor C++, proper old school C. And the great thing about C, it was really low level, so it gave you lots of power and lots of control. But the bad news about C was it gave you many ways you could screw up your life. And boy, did we screw up our lives using it. My little concern with this sort of slimming of Scrum is, yes, we're giving more applicability to more areas. We're giving more flexibility to it, which is great if you're an experienced practitioner like me. But if you're not experienced, yes, you're giving yourself many ways of ruining your life. And we've got to do something about this, I think. And I'm not sure the guide's going to help us with that. But anyway, yep, that fanfare means we are at the moment to do Nigel's nitpick of the Scrum Guide. Now, I can't take all credit for this. A lot of these nitpicks came out of fellow trainers in the Scrum Alliance who spotted them. Thank you, guys. I really appreciate it. But I'm bringing them forward. How important are these nitpicks? I don't know, but let's look into them and see what they tell us. So one of the first nitpicks is actually about a changing language. We now talk in this new guide about self-management rather than self-organisation. And I think that's interesting because many people I know have used two terms as equivalent. They regard both terms as meaning the same. And they haven't always for me. The way I've understood these things is that self-organisation is you're told what and why you're doing it, and you have power over the how. I always thought self-management was you have control over the what and the how. You're just told why. In fact, I was always told self-direction was you have control over the why, the what and the how. But again, with these definitions, I'm not sure they're commonly agreed anywhere. It looks like Schwaber and Sutherland are taking on something similar to my definition, which is this new idea of the self-managing Scrum team. So the self-managing team owns the what and the how, rather than the self-organising dev team just owning the how. This sort of broader understanding of the self-managing team. But that takes us into something really odd in this guide. In fact, it's so odd, I'm a bit suspicious about it. So look at this map. This is a map of near where I live in Bristol. I used to live just a few roads down from here. You can see the local theatre. You can see the little roads. You can even see this little one here, Lie Close. But Lie Close doesn't exist. It's not real. It's been put in the map by A to Z to catch people copying their maps. Well, I'm concerned this next thing is something like that because it's so incongruous compared to all the other conversations Sutherland and Schwaber have been having about Scrum. They're changing the name of one of the roles. Not Scrum Master, not Product Owner, but the development team. They're changing the name of the development team to developers. And I think that's kind of odd. Because this entire conversation about expanding Scrum into other areas has always been a concern about techie language or nerdy language or IT language and saying, you know what, Scrum's bigger than IT, it can be applied in more places. We don't want to get them too wrapped up with IT language. Yet they're using the term developers for the third role. Now, we did that years ago. It seems to be almost be a step backwards to me. And it's very, very nerdy. I know we can explain, when we say developers, we mean people who develop the product, the artists, the designers, the testers, the animators, the sculptors. That's great. But if they're really hoping to make this more agnostic outside of tech, I think they should have chosen a better term than developers. I think development team was actually a better term there. But I'll be interested to see their thinking behind it, or whether it's a bit... We're going to have to spend a lot of time explaining, when we say developers, we don't mean developers, we mean developers. And you know what? I said about the 3 roles in Scrum? Well, the word role has gone from that guide as well. Now we're using the word accountabilities. And again, slightly odd to me. The way I see Scrum done best is when, yes, these aren't roles, these are jobs. Like your job's Scrum Master or your job's Product Owner. That seems to work better in life anyway. The professionalization of work. After all, you wouldn't want to hire someone who's playing the role of your accountant, would you? Or playing the role of your firefighter, or playing the role of your surgeon. No. And so, are they hoping that accountability sounds stronger than roles? Well, I hope so, but hope is not a strategy. I would have been much happier if they'd chosen the term job, though, to be honest, and I don't see why they couldn't. We're deep into the nitpicking ocean now, but getting rid of this idea of development team, I think, loses some important nuance that I don't think people have really managed to communicate in Scrum properly yet. The idea of the people actually doing the physical work being slightly different to the people who referee that work or the people who feed that work, i.e. product owner and Scrum Master. Now, I know everyone struggled with this idea of, there's a Scrum team, and inside the Scrum team there's another team that's slightly smaller, but also a team. Yes, that is odd. I know that's odd. And I don't think that works well as an explanation. But removing that inner team concept also bothers me a bit, because product owner and Scrum Masters are different animals. They're playing a different game. Is the referee on the football team? I'm not sure they are. Facilitators are desperately neutral. Product owner. I've often used the analogy of a goalkeeper. I know in the football theory, the idea is the goalkeeper's on the football team, but also the goalkeeper's kind of not on the football team. They've got a really different role with really different responsibilities, which means that sometimes they feel deeply integrated in the team, and sometimes they feel like complete strangers to the team. I can tell you about that. I played in goal for 25 years. And so that sort of in or out of the team concept, that sort of part of it and not part of it. My worry is by just claiming product owner, Scrum Master and the developers are a whole team and there's no sort of inner team of workers. Well, I'm just concerned by that simplification may lose some nuance there, and that nuance, that dynamic between those groups may be slightly underappreciated. I did warn you we're in nitpick territory. Here's one that sucks. They've taken the term servant leader out of the Scrum Guide. They've now used true leader. What the hell does true leader mean? What a platitude. Unlike those famous false leaders, I'm a true leader. For me, that doesn't work for me at all. That's just silly. Now, again, some people struggle with the term servant leader. Maybe they misunderstand the term servant. They get treated like the team secretary. And yeah, that sucks. Some people may not like it for historical, socio-economic reasons. But whatever you want to say about it, the concept of servant leadership has been around a long time, and there is a lot of literature on it. It's a very recognised concept. And sort of deleting it out of the Scrum Guide and replacing it with this mealy-mouthed true leader term, again, I think is missing the point. If people misunderstand servant leadership because it makes them think the Scrum Master is a lesser person, well, that's a mistake that we've got to work on. But just trashing the entire history of servant leadership because of one term, I think that's just silly. Sprint planning. So classically, sprint planning used to have two parts. What and how. And I remember back in the day, the what part was when your product owner told you what needed to be done. They were then thrown out the room and then you worked on the how. But that was a long time ago. Well, the idea in sprint planning is to have 3 topics. Not parts, but topics. And those topics are what and how and why. Yep, ladies and gentlemen, we're seeing the rebirth of the sprint goal. Something I'm a huge fan of, and I think it's been lost along the way in many Scrum teams. The idea of an overarching aim or overarching goal on the sprint itself. We should be able to discuss that and explain that in sprint planning, and even more importantly than that, explain the why of all this stuff. We want our teams to be missionaries, not mercenaries, and understanding the what and understanding the why are 2 key things to do that. So for me, that's a good thing. It's nice to see that brought to the surface in the latest guide. Now, okay, nerdland again. Sprints, they're no longer time boxed, they're fixed length. What's the difference? Well, this has been a big discussion amongst some of us, but it looks like the actual term time box means a fixed period of time to do something. But if you get it done earlier, the time box expires early. You don't want to sit in that room all day, do you? Waiting for your official 4 hours of sprint planning to pass, do you? You get it done in 90 minutes, sprint planning is over. But that's not how sprints work, is it? Sprints don't expire when you're done. You pull more work in. So sprints are fixed length. They do not expire early. Though, like time boxes, They do not expire late. Yeah, and wrapped into sprints, most of the sprints cancellation material in the guide has been removed, which I think is pretty sensible. I know Ken Schwaber always had a fascination with sprint terminations, and I think back in the early days of Scrum, when our work was quite large and done in parallel and done being interfered with by outsiders, there being a good argument for some serious understanding of destroying or terminating sprints. But these days, with minimizing work in progress, small sushi slice stories, intelligent, progressive management and product management working with us, I very rarely see sprint terminations these days, so I'm glad they're not spending a lot of time in the guide on that topic. Back to the Nigel Scale. So when I started Scrumming, the daily Scrum had 3 questions that were compulsory in all Scrums. Nigel Scale 1. And then, a little while ago, a few guides ago, those questions became optional. Where have I been? Where am I going? What's going wrong? Those things have become optional. They've gone from core practice to good practice. Well, in the latest version of the guide, they've dropped out completely. There's no mention of those questions at all. Have they fallen into bad practice? That would be interesting. I'd love to hear what Jeff and Ken say about that, because I do see those 3 questions abused a lot. But I think, from my experience, they still live in that sort of good practice area. But it's interesting to see that being completely removed from the daily Scrum, giving you even more flexibility in that Scrum than before. Here's something new. So I mentioned sprint goal earlier on. This idea is a commitment or an attribute on the sprint backlog is the sprint goal. Well, they're adding a new one to the product backlog. And listen to this fanfare, because this has been a long time coming. This commitment or attribute on the product backlog is product goal. Finally, the guide has caught up with everyone else. Most of us for the last 10 years have been saying that you start Scrum with a vision or some aim or some sense of purpose, and finally that guide has caught up with what's actually going on in industry, this product goal concept. Now, to read the guide itself, the way they describe a goal sounds a little bit more specific than perhaps we've described visions in the past, but it's the same animal in the same space. Whether you call it a product goal, a vision, a sense of purpose, it's some idea of a direction, some big understanding of why and where we're going. That's now an aspect of the product backlog, and I'm really glad to see that. Thank God for that. Here's a funky little one. The word estimate has completely dropped out of the guide. The word size is used in a few places, but estimate has gone. Now, that doesn't mean you don't estimate. Of course it doesn't mean that. But it does mean perhaps some of the heavier focus in earlier versions of Scrum have had on estimating. That seems to have been lessened quite a lot. Whether that's embracing the no estimates movement, or whether it's just embracing reality, that over-focusing on estimates in complex work is a silly thing to do anyway, I think that's pretty reasonable. I'll be interested to see how people apply that. I've used estimates a lot over my career, especially with newer teams or newer problems, estimating to help us understand where we are, to help us break down the work. And I've also worked with many mature teams where the need to estimate in any level of detail has fallen away. So the level of detail and estimation is something you need a huge amount of variation on. So I'm glad to see that happening. Just a little worried by taking some of that stuff out of the guide. Are they leaving people who are slightly newer to this a little bit exposed to risk? If we're a new team in a new product and we jump in without any idea of where we're going in terms of estimates or work, I think we can get into trouble. And that's another interesting thing. Actually now, the Scrum Guide defines what it means by a product. Shall we look what it says? It says, a product is a vehicle to deliver value. It has a clear boundary, known stakeholders, well-defined users or customers. A product could be a service, a physical product, or something more abstract. In terms of sprint backlogs, I mentioned we've got this sprint goal thing, which has been around since forever, but it's being pushed more heavily in the new guide. There's also some stuff removed around the sort of summing of where we are. The official quote is, monitoring sprint progress through summing the remaining work. That's all been removed now. Now the idea is more, should have enough detail they can inspect their progress in the daily Scrum. So that stuff about summing your total amount of remaining work to see where you are, that to me sounds like a bit of junk DNA left over from the days when we used to do burn down charts as a compulsory thing. Now, to be frank, I still do burn down charts, but maybe that's just me. But the idea that optional, I think that's important. And how you track where you are should also be something open to variation and not one size fits all. Increment. Here's an interesting line. Each increment is additive to all prior increments and thoroughly verified, ensuring all the increments work together. That's quite a nice line. And that shows how this stuff is very gestalt. It's very, you build it together. The whole is more than the sum of the parts. But in the guide, they've dropped away a lot of the nerdy language around that, around defining done and definition of done, etc. This is an interesting line. However, an increment may be delivered to stakeholders prior to the end of the sprint. The sprint review should never be considered a gate to releasing value. That's really nice. They're making it clear that continuous delivery is a good thing in Scrum. And it's one bit of negative language I've seen in this guide, really, about what a sprint view is not. It's not stopping you releasing value. You don't have to wait every 2 weeks. You can release value frequently through the experience. I like that that's opened up as a legitimate, viable option. We've all done it in the past. It's just nice that the guide has caught up to the reality of the situation. It's interesting actually looking at that conversation around sprint review. It looks like the new version is very positive about releasing value early, and the older version of sprint review in previous guide was about preventing the release of undone work. Oh, there's a third form of commitment, or a third attribute. So we've got the product backlog with its product goal, vision. We've got the sprint backlog with its sprint goal, and then finally we've got the increment itself. And what's the attribute or the commitment on the increment? That is definition of done. So that's being made very explicit and very clear. And again, that was interesting. In previous versions of the guide, the definition of done lived in sort of a weird space where it wasn't officially an artifact, yet it was sort of floating around in that sort of semi-artifact space around artifact visibility, sort of not officially part of an artifact, but also a key part of Scrum. Well, it turns out now it's an aspect of the increment, it's an aspect of that, and it's sort of like the attribute or the commitment is the definition of done there. And again, interesting. I'm glad to see that sort of taken from good practice into core practice. However, for me, defining done is a lot bigger than a mere definition of done. So defining done for me, that's about visions on quality, that's about acceptance criteria. It isn't just about the definition of done. So I hope when they're talking about definition of done, they understand that broader remit and understand that broader context of done. I'm assuming they are. We've got to make sure that when we implement this stuff in real life, that people understand a mere definition of done is not enough. There are many other conversations that we need to include around defining done. There's a few final little pieces that other colleagues brought up. I think one brought up the issue of being concerned about if you have multiple increments in a sprint, does that mean you have multiple definitions of done, or does it open up that option? And I believe some of the ancillary material that Ken and Jeff have produced for this guide rules that out. The idea of those increments that are produced early are all the sum of a greater increment. My only concern with that is if it's in the ancillary document and not in the key document, it's like relying on cutscenes in a movie explaining the plot, where those scenes were cut for a reason, and if they're missing from the film, a lot of people won't understand what was actually going on. I think it was the film The Big Sleep that famously they cut scenes that explained who murdered the chauffeur. So to this day, it doesn't officially say in the film. I'm concerned if they're putting extra material out there in ancillary documents and not in the guide, that could easily be missed. But that, again, that's a nitpick on a nitpick. Here's an interesting little PS for you scaling aficionados out there. Here's a quote from the Scrum team section. If Scrum teams become too large, they should consider reorganizing into multiple cohesive Scrum teams, each focused on the same product. Therefore, they should share the same product goal, product backlog, and product owner. So it looks to me that this 2020 Scrum Guide is ruling out multiple product owners for large products. That may put the cat amongst the pigeons for you less and safe fans out there. So, those are the things that I spotted and other people in the Scrum Alliance spotted around this document. Some of them could be misunderstandings by us or even mistakes by Ken and Jeff. Hopefully that'll come out in the wash over the next few months. How's it going to affect actual implementations of Scrum? Well, as some of my colleagues said, it won't affect how we train. A lot of this is lining up with how we do Scrum anyway. It's just making it clear core practice, what we always used to talk about as advisory good practice. So that's good news for us, but it's not about trainers. My concern with the new guide is by offering up this simpler, clearer version of Scrum as a definition, it opens up the opportunity for people to misuse it. There are more gaps to be filled with more bad things if we're not careful. By making it slimmer and lower and smaller, we're making it more like C, more potentially dangerous to be used and abused. So as coaches, Scrum Masters, facilitators, Agile fans, we've got to make sure that this stuff's done in the right way. We've got more flexibility, great, but with that flexibility comes risk. So we must be cautious. And I'm a little bit worried that some of the less noble purveyors of agile arts out there may use that as an excuse to pivot or take Scrum into directions which it's really not meant to go in. Maybe that's me with my little devil hat still on from Halloween. He hasn't gone fully, but I'm just a little bit concerned about that. I think there is a good argument for there being a need for something a bit more detailed for the wider community. Not for the people, not for the experts, but for the civilians, the normal human beings using Scrum. There is a need for a bit more literature out there with a bit more rigour to support this definition. Because in the end, the map is not the territory. This Scrum guide is a definition of Scrum. It is not Scrum in itself. And so understanding that nuance and that context, and we as a community doing something on that, I think is going to be really important over the next 18 months. But we'll see. We'll see what happens on that. Okay, I think I'm done. I think that's everything I wanted to talk about. There may be a few things I'll drop in via voiceover earlier on, so listen out for a change in my voice. That'll be a sign I've edited it. But I found it interesting to deep dive into this new version of Scrum, this new version of the Scrum guide. I'll be interested to see how you do it out there, because of course, a lot of this stuff's never been done till Ken and Jeff wrote it. It's not been tested anywhere, has it? And so I'll be testing it on people like you. I'll be interested to see whether these small nuances and changes do have an effect on how you do Scrum. Please send me some feedback on that, either positively or negatively. I'll be interested to know either way. Okay, let's stay in contact on this. Thanks for watching. I hope this video is a little bit useful, and if not useful, I at least hope it filled up 20 minutes of your time. Thank you so much. It's been great seeing you all. Take care. I'll see you all again soon. Goodbye.
Next episode, Safecracker.